Hello, my name is Claude Butner, and I have the honor of being host facilitator today. Welcome to our 254th CACOR Live presentation. The title is Grassroots Alternatives to Bipartisan Extractivism and Ecocide, Strategy and Prospects. While much is made of the political divide between conservative and liberal parties in the West, when it comes to environmental policies, the ruling classes prioritize resource extraction and energy production. This is true in both democracies and dictatorships, resulting in a situation of bipartisan ecocide, where the ebb and flow of politics matters little when it comes to core environmental issues like climate change, overshoot, technological escalation, and growth. This talk will advocate for the individual embrace of a biocentric orientation and the communal orientation towards a biodiverse movement of movements, characterized by mutually supporting elements of deep ecology, degrowth, radical permaculture, social democracy, and revolutionary vanguardism. We'll explore strategies that appear to show promise, as well as significant barriers this movement faces. Our speaker today is Max Wilbert. He is a writer and biocentric community organizer. He has been part of grassroots political work for 20 years and is the founder of Protect Thacker Pass. Max is the author of two books, most recently, Bright Green Lies, How the Environmental Movement Lost Its Way and What We Can Do About It, Monkfish Press 2021. His work has been featured on CNN, The New York Times, NPR, Le Monde, BBC, and elsewhere. Max, welcome back. You have the floor.
Thank you, Cloud. Thank you, Art, Dave, everyone else. It's an honor to be here again. Sometimes when I'm doing public presentations, I tell a joke about how my dad gave an important public presentation 20 years ago, thought he did a great job, and then looked down as he walked out of the room and realized his fly was unzipped. Luckily, I don't have to worry about that problem since this is virtual. But Claude introduced me a bit, but my name is Max Wilbert. I live in Oregon in the United States. I grew up in Washington State, so I've actually spent quite a bit of time in Canada. And I'm a community organizer and an activist. I've been doing this work for something around 20 years. So this is the talk that we're going to dive into today. We're going to talk about the collapse of industrial civilization, what that looks like, and what some grassroots alternatives to failed state systems could look like in future years and decades. This is a photo from 2023. It's actually after the last time that I joined you all for a presentation here. I took part in this action at Thacker Pass that involved climbing on top of heavy equipment to blockade the construction of an open pit mine. The title of this article that I wrote about it is How to Stop Worrying and Love the Bulldozer, which of course is an ode to Dr. Strangelove. And that's the world that we're living in now. It's this very strange world where people who are claiming to be protecting the environment, to be saving the planet, to be acting in our best interests are actually perpetuating some of the worst destruction. So the presentation today is going to focus on a few different things. I'm going to lay out 12 different premises that explain in broad terms my worldview. I'd like to be explicit about those in the beginning so that people know where I'm coming from, and also because we don't really have time to dive into all of those. Each of these premises could be an entire presentation. So I want to lay them out, and then we can just move forward from that basis. If we agree, great. If we disagree, that's fine too. We're going to talk about how the political situation has shifted since 2023 when I last spoke with you all. Obviously, I'm in the United States. Biden was in power. Now we have Trump. And I'm going to talk about the differences, but also the similarities between then and now. And I'm going to talk about grassroots alternatives to the systems that, as I mentioned, have failed or were never capable of succeeding in the first place. So my first premise is that modern industrial society is functionally unsustainable. So in other words, its unsustainability is not peripheral. It's not a solvable issue. It's central to the structure of industrial civilization. Energy use, agriculture, population growth, material consumption. And I'm sure many of you have seen this graph that's shown here that shows the average lifespan of many civilizations throughout history. So because of this, premise 2 is that industrial civilization will collapse. We don't know exactly when, but this way of life will not last. That's what unsustainable means. Third premise. The collapse of unsustainable systems is by definition a reversion to sustainability, towards sustainability at least. So when the collapse of industrial civilization occurs, the natural world will, in general and in the long term, be better off. And this, of course, includes future human beings, if they exist, who, like all creatures, rely on healthy ecology for survival. And this is directly related to premise 4, which is illustrated in these graphs here. I don't have to introduce these graphs to this audience. They're the great acceleration graphs. This is the limits to growth in action. You've got population, GDP, investments, CO2 concentration, all sorts of measures of ecological impact and the scale of the human enterprise, all skyrocketing, all looking like hockey sticks. So premise 4 is that the longer industrial civilization continues to exist, the higher population rises, the more greenhouse gases are released, et cetera, et cetera. Many people assume that the longer industrial civilization continues, the more time we have to find solutions. But this is actually an extraordinary claim that I don't believe is matched by any of the evidence. The evidence is laid out in these graphs right here, and it's all pointing in the opposite direction, that the longer this continues, the worse things get. And that leads us to premise number 5. For the time being, the vast majority of human beings, which is billions of people, of course, are dependent for our continued existence on this unsustainable way of life. Our food, clothing, healthcare, shelter, everything, all of this emerges from industrial civilization. So the collapse of this system, which has already begun, in my opinion, in many peripheral states and in many different peripheries of industrial civilization, represents a threat to human lives and well-being. Premise number 6 is that this isn't a problem because by definition, problems have solutions. So it's a conundrum instead. It's a predicament to which there is no simple solution and probably no solution at all. And this predicament is called overshoot. Again, many of you probably agree with most of what I have said thus far. These are probably basics that you've been over many times. Premise 7, as illustrated in this comic by my friend Stephanie McMillan, brilliant political cartoonist, is that this is not the only way to live. Human societies have existed and still exist in many places around the planet that have lived more or less in a state of ecological balance for thousands of years in many cases, which is the bulk of human history. By this, I don't mean that humans have had no impact, because of course we're a keystone species, we're an apex predator, and we're going to cause major disruptions when entering a new environment for the first time. Premise number 8. This is the topic of my presentation that I gave to this group a number of years ago, is the idea that green technology will make industrial civilization sustainable is another extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. The evidence actually does not exist that that could be true. For more on that, I'm not going to dive into that very much in this talk. Check out my previous talk to this group. Check out Planet Critical podcast. I was on there in 2022. My book, Bright Green Lies. Bill Reese, who I believe is part of this group, wrote a great paper called Through the Eye of the Needle in 2021. There's a lot of resources out there. And again, I probably don't need to point you all towards this. Which leads us to premise number 9. Modern industrial civilization, like all empires in history, is hierarchical. Those on top exploit those below using violence and a threat of violence, such as laws, to bolster their wealth, comfort, and power. And this violence is normalized, it's accepted, it's often invisibilized in society. And in contrast with that, violence from those lower on hierarchies towards those higher or towards the systems themselves is fetishized. People react to it with horror. So a few examples from this. We've got a US Navy formation here on the upper left. The bottom left picture, many of you will probably recognize. It's from the Oka crisis at Kanasatake in 1990, where Mohawk warriors stood off against the Canadian military to protect a forest and a significant cultural site. Defining moment in Canadian history, of course, as I don't need to tell you all. Premise 10. Specific numbers are really hard to come up with to define sustainability, but as a reasonable starting point, just for the sake of discussion, sustainability probably means at least an 80% reduction in the scale of the human enterprise, right? As a starting point. This isn't a value judgment, it's just an observation of the ecological facts. That's premise number 10. Premise number 11. There are many ways this reduction could happen, this 80% reduction in the scale of the human enterprise. Right now, we're on the worst case or the near worst case pathway by which this reduction could happen. And that pathway is defined by unconstrained economic growth, uncontrolled population growth and consumption and pollution, driving rapid growth, leading to regional collapses and global or near global collapse. This uncontrolled pathway ultimately maximizes economic growth and wealth creation and shareholder returns in the short term at the price of catastrophic human suffering, non-human suffering, death, and the breakdown of basic social order, human rights, and well-being. That's the path that we're on right now. And then finally, premise number 12 is that other pathways exist. Collapse is not a single event, of course, it's a complex process composed of many, many different parts playing out in different ways at different speeds around the planet. And some of these processes we could say are positive, and some of them we could judge as negative. So our task now, in my opinion, is to maximize the positive aspects of collapse, things like reductions in energy use and therefore declines in pollution, in extraction, relocalization of society, while at the same time working to soften the negative aspects of collapse, things like the breakdown in food systems, the rise of warlords and tyrannical leaders, breakdowns in civil society, rising open colonialism and imperialistic violence as resource grabs. And so collapse, of course, will be incredibly difficult, but we may be able to some extent to control just how hard it will be, just how difficult it will be. And our main levers with which to exert that control are resistance, in other words, opposition to these systems of power, which are underlying industrial civilization and destroying the planet, and resilience, which is building alternative ways of living, alternative ways of surviving. So those are my 12 premises. I'm not going to try to justify those premises really in this talk, because again, I think many of us probably agree on most of them, if not all of them. And if we don't agree, then I'm probably not going to convince you in this presentation. You know, some of you may recognize this. The book Endgame uses a premise approach similar to this to start off the book. This isn't copied directly from that, but I've read that book several times, so some of the ideas are probably in here. I haven't copied it word for word, but I'm sure there's similarities. And many other people have been using this approach for a long time, sharing these types of ideas. So let's get into the next section of the presentation now, and we've laid that out. So as I mentioned, when I spoke to you in 2023, Biden was in office in the United States. The Inflation Reduction Act had just been passed. So you have all these tax credits, government loans, grants, price guarantees, other forms of subsidies going to the electric vehicle industry, the solar panel industry, wind power, mining, and so on. And there's a summary of the premises. This is what Wainwright and Mann, who are two authors, I believe Jeff Mann is actually at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. He's one of the authors of this book, Climate Leviathan, from 2018. It's an interesting book, but I can summarize the main ideas in this presentation. They term this approach that's characterized by what Biden was doing in 2023 as climate leviathan. And they write, describing what they mean by that climate leviathan is an emergent global order committed to the consolidation of capitalism via the organization of a form of planetary sovereignty, centralized power, in other words, that can overcome the collective action problem. So in other words, it's sort of a fusion, a center-right fusion of neoliberal free market capitalism with state socialism and an internationalist sort of UN type approach to advance certain sectors of the market, of industry, in an attempt to reduce carbon emissions while maintaining economic growth. And this political approach under the Biden administration and its allies, Trudeau and so on around the world, was being married with empire, with an imperial approach. There's a quote from Jennifer Granholm, who was the Secretary of Energy under Biden, who said in 2022, she was in Europe at the time, I believe. She said, "No country has ever been able to weaponize clean power. And ultimately, moving in that direction is the greatest solution for us and our allies in Europe." And I think this quote encapsulates that many of these people in power, they look at energy production, raw materials extraction, critical minerals, all these sorts of industrial sectors as weapons to be wielded in the game of empires. And, this is also a defining political characteristic of, Merkel, now Merz in Germany, Trudeau, who I mentioned, many other governments around the world. So this was the context a couple years ago when I spoke with you all. Essentially, that talk focused on premise 8, as I mentioned. But now, obviously, the situation has changed somewhat significantly. So in going back to Wainwright and Mann's book, they lay out 4 total possible futures or political tendencies that are coming to define the new geopolitical world order that is arising due to the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and different orientations towards addressing it or not addressing it as state approaches in the 21st century. So we just mentioned climate leviathan. Donald Trump is characteristic of this middle political tendency, which they describe this as a global arrangement animated by a chauvinistic capitalist and nationalist politics that denies, until it can only denounce, the threat that climate change poses to national capitals or to states. So this is the politics of Trump. It's also Bolsonaro in Brazil, former president, Milei in Argentina, Meloni in Italy, as well as many other figures, Elon Musk, Bezos, Peter Thiel, the Koch brothers, institutions like the Heritage Foundation. Many of the wealthiest and most powerful individuals and entities on the planet fall into this climate behemoth camp. Of course, there's flexibility there. There's overlap. Many of those same billionaires cozied up to the Biden administration, the Trudeau administration, and kind of flowed seamlessly between these political tendencies. This is something that I'm going to talk about and expand on a little bit more here shortly. But climate behemoth is this far-right capitalist worldview that sees growth and expansion and progress driven by the strongest and most capable people and states, as sort of a self-conscious exploitation of the natural world, of workers, of peripheral nations and peoples, as right, as the way to go. It's might makes right approach. It's sort of a purified ideology that's closely linked, of course, to colonization, to slavery, to tyranny. It's often wrapped up in these ideologies, which some of you may have heard of, or maybe you've discussed in these groups, effective altruism or long-termism. Um, just briefly, effective altruists are people who would say, for instance, that the best way to help the planet, to make the world a better place, would be not to work for a nonprofit or to dedicate your life to community service or some sort of communal work. It's to get the highest paying job you possibly can, and then to make a ton of money, and then use that money to create the most good possible by sort of the classic approach that they talk about is buying malaria nets for poor communities in Africa where malaria is endemic, and thus reduce human suffering by a large amount due to your wealth. Elon Musk, of course, for him, this means going to Mars. It means expanding the human population into the trillions, as he's talked about, going to Mars, becoming a multi-planetary civilization. And so in his worldview, creating misery, exploiting workers brutally, creating ecological devastation on Earth now is worth it, in his worldview, if it enables the existence and thriving of trillions of human beings in the future. That's the calculus that he uses, at least to attempt to justify his worldview. So of course, there's a continuity between these political perspectives. And I'm going to talk about the third one, climate Mao, here in a moment. These two on the left, Leviathan and Behemoth, they share many overlaps. They share that they take growth, capitalism, and profit as a given. They share an orientation towards extractive industrial economics. Both of these approaches prioritize nationalism over a true internationalism. And what I mean by that is that, while Climate Leviathan may embrace institutions like the United Nations, while Climate Behemoth rejects it, both of them are going to contribute to and protect a world order that keeps nations like the Democratic Republic of the Congo in a subordinate neo-colonial state. They're both going to actively continue that process that's been going on for many years, with places like the DRC, like Bangladesh, like Indonesia, like many others. And Climate Mao, which of course refers to China, it fits into this paradigm as well. All three of these formations are ways of organizing industrial civilization, of organizing power, of organizing empire. They're state forms, right, that are dedicated to expanding a planetary civilization. And I would, Wainwright and Mann, in their book, they describe climate Mao, what's happening in China essentially, as anti-capitalist. I would actually contest that. I think that what's happening in China is it dovetails incredibly well with capitalism. Of course, most of the world's industries, most of the world's production, raw materials, is coming out of China. It's, in my view, it's authoritarian state capitalism. It's not a state in which people have meaningful control over anything in their lives, let alone the means of production. And ecologically, of course, it's been a disaster. I don't know if you can see this, if the video will cut it off, but China's Engine of Ecological Collapse by Richard Smith. I just read this book a couple weeks ago. It's a pretty brutal explanation, deep dive into what's happened in China over the last couple decades ecologically. So, does all this mean that no meaningful change is possible within the system as it exists? Well, I don't have to tell this group, I'm sure, that some types of change are possible within the system and other types are not. So here, this graph shows the different global climate agreements, and it shows rising atmospheric CO2 levels. Basically no change in the rates of rise and acceleration, in fact, that's taking place. This only goes up to 2020, but these trends have continued since then. On the one hand, you have situations like global warming. These are complex, systemic problems that require fundamental redistributions, rearrangements, or losses of power for certain groups. That is very, very challenging to achieve within our current government and state form. On the other hand, you have situations like the ozone hole, right? That's relatively minor problem in the scheme of the amount of disruption that solving it required. It's a technical change. They swapped out the types of refrigerants they were using, and they were able to address this problem pretty successfully. That type of problem can be solved using existing state forms. At least it has been in the past. Climate crisis and more systemic, broad-reaching, complex issues that are deeply entangled with our well-being, the functioning of our economy, and our entire society, very, very difficult to change. Of course, you all know this. So I recently read a book by Norman Finkelstein, the scholar, and he was writing about the civil rights movement in the United States. And he wrote about how that movement was successful. And in his opinion, one of the key elements in the success of the civil rights movement is that white Northerners could be supportive of the demands of the civil rights movement. They could occupy the moral high ground because they didn't really have to make any personal sacrifices. The burden of the changes that were proposed by the movement were being borne by other people, by whites in the South, essentially. That was where sacrifices were going to be required. And this is actually something that Dave and I were discussing briefly on the planning call yesterday in preparation for this talk, that under slavery, a very similar thing took place in the United States, for example. Northern states actually didn't have much to lose by abolishing the system of slavery. Southern states did. There was a major material disruption to their way of life, their economics, the very foundation of their society. And this makes change very, very difficult within established power structures. So one more example of this. I think my slides are out of order here. I'll come back to those. One more example. So I'm studying for a master's degree in degrowth right now at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And I think the degrowth movement provides a pretty academically robust approach to look at to what extent is a democratic transformation of the existing state possible or not, given our conditions today. I have critiques of the degrowth movement. It's a broad umbrella. There are people within that movement who I agree with and others who I don't, but I still think it's a very useful starting place and a place that we can use in this discussion as a proxy to examine public support for the types of politics that we're talking about. So this paper is called Prerequisites for a Degrowth Paradigm Shift, and it looks at what's actually required for these changes to take place. And very similar to Finkelstein's analysis of the civil rights movement, the paper identifies 4 prerequisites for socioeconomic paradigm shifts. So deep crisis, we obviously have that. An alternative political project. It's debatable whether or not that exists. To some extent it does, to some extent it doesn't. 3 is a comprehensive coalition of social forces promoting the project in political struggles. We don't really have that. And 4 is broad-based consent. We also do not have that. And this is what the paper concludes. The prospects for a degrowth paradigm shift remain bleak. Degrowth has neither support from a comprehensive coalition of social forces nor any consent to its agenda among the broader population. I really recommend reading the paper in full. It's quite interesting, but it's a bit sobering. And again, this is probably something that won't come as a surprise to you all. So back to Mann and Wainwright's book. The 4th form, the fourth political response that they describe to the climate crisis, the broader ecological crisis, they call climate X. And they're using this term to describe a collection of movements that pursue global climate justice, build non-capitalist political economies, and construct solidarity at multiple scales to reject the political logic of sovereignty or centralized power. This is quite interesting to me. And this, of course, includes movements like degrowth, like grassroots resistance movements, potentially some eco-socialist projects to the extent that they truly reject capitalism and embrace degrowth principles, and so on. And these are all built upon a fundamentally different common sense, a fundamentally different ideology and basic understanding of the world. And this sensibility has always existed, but it's becoming more common. I believe it's the most important idea in the world right now. And the term I use for it is biocentrism. And of course, it just simply means taking life, the biosphere, the planet, as the center of our worldview, our culture, our orientation. Many of you will probably recognize this artwork on the right here. This is from Micmac territory when there was a conflict over fracking in Eastern Canada, what's now Eastern Canada. This was probably 10 years ago now. This is from a photograph when riot police were showing up to remove the Indigenous protesters who were stopping this fracking project on their traditional territories. And I think what emerges from a biocentric orientation is significantly different from an anthropocentric worldview, which puts humans in the center and sees environmental destruction as only a problem insofar as it hurts us. Biocentrism isn't all about us. It involves a sense of humility, that we're just one part of the broader symphony of life. And I think this represents a fundamental change in how we approach our organizing, what our goals are, how we conduct our work. And most grassroots environmental action on the planet really emerges from a biocentric worldview to some extent. We're talking here about movements that have no political or legal authority behind them, by and large, have no institutional backing, have zero or little financial resources. All they have is people. They have conviction, they have passion, they have a biocentric worldview, a heart for what's happening, and they have courage. And here's a few examples of these. We're talking about resistance to mining projects, Thacker Pass, of course, which I was involved in. Hakamwe is a sacred site in northern Arizona. The Wallapai tribe have been fighting to protect this place. In Serbia, of course, you have major resistance to lithium mining. Forest defense projects. I was recently supporting a tree sit in Washington State, protecting these forests that were not old growth, but were logged and naturally regrew prior to World War II. So are aging into old growth characteristics and are very biodiverse, sequestering a lot of carbon. This is essentially the next generation of old growth that's being recruited right now. And Washington State, this is on state-owned land, is cutting down quite a bit of this. And of course, in Canada, where you all are, the Fairy Creek movement on Vancouver Island, the largest civil disobedience movement in Canadian history, working to protect old growth forests. Different forms of pipeline resistance at the Unistoten camp, again, unceded Wet'suwet'en territory in British Columbia. The Gidimt'en checkpoint is right there as well. The Unistoten and Gidimt'en are two clans of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. Standing Rock, the Line 3 opposition, Line 3 pipeline, different types of direct action. All these movements are happening around the world, and they're largely happening, again, without any institutional backing of any sort, without any significant financial resources. They're organic expressions of this biocentric worldview that are popping up and going to work. Here's a few more examples of this. This is Unistoten on the bottom left. The top left is in Germany. The top right is folks shutting down tar sands pipelines coming into the United States. Some friends of mine were involved in this action. They simply broke into the pumping stations, placed a call to the pipeline operators to say, implement whatever safety protocols you need to prevent a leak because we're closing the valve right now. And they shut off 25% of the oil entering the United States within about 20 minutes. And they stuck around and waited to be arrested, but the police had no idea they were planning this action. And many of them were actually acquitted rather than when they went to trial, they were actually acquitted based on necessity defenses. They argued that because the climate crisis is so serious and governments are failing to address it in any meaningful way, this was our only recourse to take action illegally, essentially. And then these are protests right behind me here in Serbia against mining. So all this, what I've been talking about till now, is still relatively well-mannered resistance. It's resistance that is using nonviolent tactics, that's happening in public. But if we understand that millions and billions of lives are on the line, then what sort of tactics are justified? What sort of escalation is called for? Personally, I believe the moral calculus here is very clear, that eco-sabotage certainly is not only morally justified, but it's actually a moral imperative at this time. On the left here is Jessica Reznicek. She's a very brave woman who's in prison right now in the United States. She sabotaged the Dakota Access Pipeline. She was a kindergarten teacher and a Catholic worker. Catholic workers, of course, have a long history of opposing war and taking direct action in different ways. The guy on the right sabotaged some pipelines in British Columbia. I don't know too much about him. And a journalist named Chris Ketchum wrote this article in the middle recently. I believe it was in Harper's Magazine. Worth a read, absolutely worth a read. Other examples, the Earth Uprising movement in France is engaging in mass public sabotage actions. They've actually been labeled a terrorist organization by the state and outlawed, even though their actions have never resulted in a single person being hurt. They've been completely nonviolent, but they have destroyed property extensively. And they claim it as righteous and as justified by the political situation. Another example comes from Nigeria, where communities who had been subjected to the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez oil spill every year for 50 years, they originally engaged in a nonviolent resistance movement. Many of you are probably familiar with the name Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was a leader in this movement. He was a poet from the Ogoni people in the Niger River Delta. He was assassinated. He was murdered with state sanction, hanged along with many other leaders of this movement. And this led directly to the formation of a militant resistance movement, which bombed oil pipelines. There's actually a film, I guess I don't have that slide. There's a great film called Sweet Crude that goes into the story of the Niger River Delta. I highly recommend it, made by a Seattle filmmaker named Sandy Rowley. And she interviews one of the oil company workers who was kidnapped by by the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta, Monde. And this person basically says, they treated me very well, and at the end of the day, they're right, because their land, their future is being completely destroyed by oil extraction in this region. This was quite a few years ago now, and that movement was essentially put down largely with military assistance from the United States. The US sent in a lot of special forces units, as well as counterterrorism experts and so on, to conduct operations and to train the Nigerian state military to allow the oil to keep flowing. So we're also seeing this seep into fiction as well. So there was a great film a number of years ago called Woman at War, which examines a woman who engages in sort of a one-person eco-sabotage campaign in Iceland against electrical transmission towers. There's abundant geothermal energy resources because it's such a seismically active place there. And as a result, most of the world's aluminum smelting takes place in Iceland. Geothermal energy is not without major pollution problems. It can cause major acid rain, a lot of environmental destruction. You have major piping, all kinds of facility installations. It's not benign by any means. And of course, aluminum smelting is one of the most energy intensive industries on the planet, and quite polluting as well. So a very charming, beautifully done film, highly recommended. How to Blow Up a Pipeline was a nonfiction book that got turned into a fictional movie. I haven't actually seen the movie. I heard it was pretty good. And then this novel, Kim Stanley Robinson is one of the most well-known contemporary American sci-fi novelists. And Ministry for the Future was kind of a fascinating book. I'm sure many people who are here have actually read it. But in that book, of course, a militant underground movement emerges to stop the burning of fossil fuels. And they engage in very radical things, not only sabotage, but also assassinating oil company executives, blowing planes out of the sky in order to get people to stop air travel. And Kim Stanley Robinson is not necessarily advocating for those specific tactics, but he's exploring what the future could look like as we enter an era of climate disasters, millions of people dying from these disasters, and the radicalism that that will create, the anger, the rage that that will create, and the disconnect between the poorest people on the planet who are paying the price with their lives, even right now, today, in places like Pakistan, and those of us living in the wealthy nations uh, who are not paying those prices, who have access to air conditioning and can travel when there's disasters, and who are contributing to the problem far more than anyone else. So, of course, this kind of serious organized militant resistance that I'm talking about, it's not safe. Whether we're talking about nonviolent action, sabotage, or beyond, it's not safe. It's not clean. It's not unambiguously moral. It's not strategically straightforward. It's dangerous. It's dirty. It's complicated. It's going to generate intense political opposition and serious forms of state repression, vigilante pushback, and so on. And this is one reason why I want to invite people to an event that I'm actually organizing next week. It's on the 21st of July, 6 p.m. Pacific time. And this event is focused on how do we resist state repression? How do we organize? How do we build solidarity? And the event is featuring some folks, some friends of mine from the Philippines, which is the most dangerous country in the world for environmentalists, and also a friend Denzel, who works in Appalachia in Tennessee, and who's involved in anti-racist organizing that's dovetailing with sort of eco-socialist organizing. And we're trying to discuss how do we continue to organize in the face of growing intense repression that we're seeing in the United States and around the world. What are the lessons that we can learn from what's happening elsewhere, and how do we apply them here? But I'm convinced that this radical direction, this is where our movements are headed, regardless of whether or not we embrace it personally, regardless of our thoughts on it, because of the extremity of the situation we find ourselves in, because working in the existing political systems through government programs, regulations, corporate sustainability initiatives, it's just not working. It's not. And this is the direction that we're headed in. States are in many cases making this worse, of course. Look at what's happening in the UK, where groups like Just Stop Oil were outlawed after they did some pretty bold direct actions that probably can be criticized in various ways. But these groups are outlawed. People like Roger Hallam being targeted with serious prison time for attending a Zoom call, for attending a Zoom meeting. This repression pushes people underground. It pushes people towards these more radical actions and tactics because it's not working. And it's been that way for a while, frankly, in the environmental movement. There's many veterans here of that movement. I don't need to tell you all, but I often quote the old environmentalist David Brower, who, he headed the Sierra Club. He was too radical for them, so he got kicked out. He founded Earth Island Institute. And a quote that he said toward the ends of his life was, "All I have done in my career is slow the rate at which things are getting worse." That's that's rough. That's hard to swallow. So this photo right here is from Thacker Pass. It's from our resistance there. Some indigenous allies and friends set up this teepee as a ceremonial space to light a fire and say prayers and engage in some ceremonies. And this teepee was built on the GPS coordinates of a pipeline that the mining company was trying to build to bring in water for their mine. And this is the type of resistance that we need, this and more. So last November, and I'm wrapping up here because I'm aware that I'm a few minutes over. But last November, I picked up some new work with an organization called CELDF, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. They're pioneers in the rights of nature movement. They helped pass the first rights of nature law in the United States back in 2007, and they have been continuing to work on it ever since, working with dozens of communities across the country. Also helped Ecuador when they were working to put rights of nature in their constitution, and other nations. And this organization is continuing the rights of nature work, but they're pivoting to focus more on the type of work that I'm describing now. My role at CELDF is Director of Community Resilience and Resistance. And we're working to build out educational resources and training, to create and strengthen networks of cooperation, to work closely with people involved in frontline struggles, and to tie it all together with resilience work, things like relocalizing food and basic supply chains, creating systems to build soil and sequester carbon, building alternative institutions for governance along the rights of nature model and the people's assembly model, and generally sort of building up dual power alongside the state, which is becoming increasingly irrelevant to real change. So this isn't easy work. I make very little money. I work long hours. If this is going to be successful, we need to expand significantly, not just at CELDF, though, of course, we'd welcome any financial support, but across grassroots and frontline movements as a whole. Change really costs money. We need to invest in this. And we need to invest in grassroots forms of resistance and community-based resilience. The mainstream climate movement is urging people to invest in green technology, which is ultimately investing in green capitalism, which means more growth. And I think instead we need to turn away from those systems and invest in the grassroots. So I'm reminded in times like these of a quote from the Irish revolutionary James Connolly, who over a century ago wrote that revolution is never practical until the hour of the revolution strikes. Then it alone is practical, and all the efforts of the conservatives and compromisers become the most futile and visionary of human imaginings. So he didn't really mean this as an attack, but rather an observation. Times change, and I think in times like we are in now, efforts to reform and work within the system are unfortunately largely becoming irrelevant. Not entirely, there's great work being done in that arena, but largely. And that means that what's becoming the only practical approach, the only politically relevant approach, the only thing that can break the deadlock or the stalemate we find ourselves in is these more radical movements. And as far as what that looks like, I think it's a synthesis of political formations into a biocentric movement. It's grassroots resistance groups, it's alternative local and regional government structures and confederations, it's insurgent political parties, networks of resilience and ecological food production, underground eco-sabotage cells and groups, community-based alternatives to monetary economics, all working together to chart a new path, all working across political differences. And this is something that I have changed on over the years. I think like many of us when I was younger, I used to be a little less humble, but these days I've tried to learn the lessons of 20 years of organizing, and humility is a big one. It's about how do we work together across political differences. We don't have to agree on everything, but if we're moving broadly in the same direction, how can we collaborate? How can we build together? How can we build real relationships, real connections, and use those to strengthen our initiatives, to support each other for our movements, rather than simply taking action individually. And that's what we need. So With that, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I'd love to open it up for questions. I think Cloud is going to facilitate questions. Is that right?
That is correct. Thank you very much. And as the facilitator, I get the prerogative of asking the first question. You have actually answered it already. I was going to ask you, I do some what I'll call glacial, slowly working with legislatures and contacting them and all the training that goes along with that through Citizens Climate Lobby suggests that they are listening for the ask. So, what is the ask of the legislators that are in office? What you have basically cut off my question is that they're not listening. No matter what your ask is, the inaction is there. And that actually reminds me of Roger Hallam in his BBC interview, which is still online, incredibly, that he says, I'm just a farmer. And the BBC guy says, no, you're not. You're an activist. And he says, I'm an activist because you didn't do your job, referring to the BBC, the government of the UK. And so I'm going to sort of shift my question that you've already answered to has there ever been something like a global um, general strike just to see how much interest there is? People are not interested in going to jail, but they might be interested in standing outside federal buildings across the globe. Has this ever been thought about, kicked around, tried to be organized?
Yeah, it has been, and it's very, very difficult to do. I mean, I grew up in Seattle, which was the site of, I believe, the first general strike in the US, kicked off in Seattle 100 years ago when the radical labor movement was pretty strong. This was the sort of the area of the IWW and the Wobblies. And uh, strikes are powerful. So there's a quote from Judy Berry, who was a radical Earth First tree defender, tree protector in the 90s, and she was actually bombed, it's believed, by the FBI, and nearly died. She did die eventually from complications from that bombing. But Judy Berry is notable because she had a labor organizing approach to environmentalism. She really had the approach that the people who control the means of production, the apparatus of industrial civilization, are ultimately the workers. The workers have the most power to shut down that system. And we have seen that power be used in some cases, like in France a number of years ago, 10 years ago or so, there were some government attempts to cut back on pensions, to increase people's retirement age, to do some things that working people really didn't like. And the response was mass mobilizations. And one of the things people did was they blockaded the oil refineries of France. And you do that for more than a week or so, and you paralyze the entire nation's economy. That's leverage. That's real leverage. Um, the challenge here, of course, is that the that movement stopped the blockade eventually. And so, as I've said before in some of my talks, is the difference between the movement we need now and sort of a typical or traditional socialism or more left movement like that is that I believe we don't just need to seize the means of production, we need to dismantle the means of production. We need to dismantle the oil refineries, the pipelines, the industrial chemical factories, um, the industrial ports. This photo right here behind me is the port of Antwerp, which I think is one of the largest in the EU. Um, what's happening there is the movement of dead nature. I mean, it's the facilitation of commerce, which is the 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 transformation of forests into lumber, the transformation of fish into fish sticks, the transformation of soils into cereals. This is the destruction of the natural world. And so um, I'm with you, Cloud, in terms of organizing workers and strikes and the power that that has. The barrier now is consciousness. And as I talked about in one of these slides, the degrowth paradigm shift slide, if the political will for change is not present in a critical mass of the population, then that type of mass action becomes impossible. And so that's something that we really need to build is sort of a biocentric mass consciousness among people. And of course, that's easy to say. It's very difficult to do because TikTok is run by people who want to sell, more makeup and cosmetics to 10-year-old girls and more video games and stuff to 10-year-old boys. That's consumerism is driving the mainstream media now, just like it always has. And that's the main educational tool that's in use around the world. So we need to attempt to push back against that, to build our own systems, to educate youth and so on. But I can't pretend it's easy, of course.
Thank you very much. Art Hunter, you are on deck. You can turn on your camera and your mic. And Anitra, you have the floor.
Fine, but I can't turn on my mic.
Oh, I can hear you. You
Okay,
have it turned
fine.
on.
Yes,
Yeah.
all right. So my question is whether your concept of radical environmental transformation has included actual negotiation at the industrial, the economic, and the government levels. And I say this because in my 60-year career as a scientist, I have sat in the heart of the beast negotiating with oil companies, with nuclear power plants, with heavy metal extractors and manufacturers, and sewerage and other municipal. And I feel that globally, and that is West Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean, I have made some substantial changes in business as usual, but not enough to say that the pollution from this or that is gone. And what I found after about 30 years of negotiating in the heart of the beast and making changes, but incremental changes, that taking a positive attitude, I had many more people, activist people, following me. And so I invented for the nuclear power plant the first time people had restored vegetation under the water. That has worked very well. I have now tens of thousands of people around the world who are copying what I did. And these people become activists through and through because they're there replanting after the nuclear power plant or the municipal sewerage or the port or whoever has completely decimated things. They bring it back to life. And this positive set of actions, which was not possible before we started this, is what basically had the most activism of everything I have done. My second question, when you finish that one, is what is your solution for depopulation? We have one, we're trying to work on Africa from the south to the north, and it's educating women for employable skills, but that's a second set of questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anitra. Thank you for the questions and for your work. It sounds like you've been involved in some really good work. And I hope I don't give the impression, because I don't want to say that, I'm critiquing work within the system, but I don't want to come across as saying that it's useless, because it's not. I see a lot of value in it. I have friends who are involved here in the Pacific Northwest in work with agricultural enterprises to help reduce their impact on streams to improve salmon habitat and salmon populations. And those efforts over 30, 40 years have made a significant difference. They've helped. Of course, the problem, though, is not that it's not that that work is bad or worthless. It's that if global warming continues to accelerate, if the larger global problems are not solved, then ultimately that work becomes wasted, which would be an absolute shame, right? And so, a few thoughts that I want to share on this. Negotiation is possible when you share values, right? That's the basis of negotiation, is let's figure out what our overlap is. And then let's build from there. Let's build some agreements based on that overlap. And sometimes that's present, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes there's a fundamental conflict between the values that you have. So for example, at Thacker Pass, fighting this mining company, our primary goal wasn't to make the mine less destructive, to make the mine smaller and not impact a certain area, to make the mine use less water. Our primary goal was to stop the mine. And the mining company's primary goal was to build the mine. And so that we came to a point where there was no negotiation possible. There are other groups who chose to focus more on those uh, getting what victories they could, perhaps increasing the quality of the pollution control measures the company had to implement. And, like I said, I'm not saying that those efforts are worthless. Personally, in that case, I chose not to do that because I don't think it's possible to make a mine sustainable. It's possible to make it slightly less harmful, but in some cases that might be tinkering around the edges. And the final thing I wanted to say is that this reminds me of a quote from David Graeber, the old anthropologist who passed away a number of years ago. And he was talking about a letter that oil company executives wrote to, I'm not sure what government, essentially saying, please regulate us. We're very concerned about global warming as individuals. And what he pointed out, of course, is that oil company executives of publicly traded companies have a legal responsibility to maximize profits. And that means that they are prevented by the structure of law from doing actions to make their industry sustainable, which would essentially mean eventually abolishing their industry pretty rapidly. So they're prevented from doing that. And if they attempt to do so, they'll be removed by their board of directors and replaced by somebody who will toe the party line. So these are challenges. And then, I'm also thinking of a quote from Martin Luther King. It may have been from letter from the Birmingham jail. Somebody was asking him about negotiation and direct action and saying, why don't we use negotiation? Why do we need to use these confrontational direct action tactics? And he says, you're quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. I think this is an interesting point, that perhaps creating a dichotomy between direct action and confrontation and negotiation is a bad idea in the first place, that they should instead be conceived of as two strategies or two tactics as part of the same movement, the same strategy. And then, sorry, I'm going on, but your second question about population, I actually meant to share. So one of the slides that I shared, I probably didn't I didn't explain this, I'm realizing in retrospect, but it's the slide that I shared here. I'm going to pull it up again. When I was talking about population in my premises. Window share. And this is a, okay. This is a set of stamps from Iran. So interest from 1972. And interestingly, Iran had the highest birth rate in the world after
Can you share that
Iran.
again, Max? It briefly came up and then it disappeared. There we go. It's back.
Yeah. So after the Iran-Iraq war, they had a very high birth rate, essentially the maximum biologically possible, and their population was exploding rapidly. And they decided to implement a program to try and stabilize their population. And they got the government on board, they got religious authorities on board, and it was incredibly successful. And so in terms of technically how to go about these things, how to stabilize and then naturally reduce population, it's actually technically pretty straightforward. There's major cultural barriers, of course, political barriers to it, but technically we know exactly how to do it. It's very, very straightforward. They made birth control widely available. Everyone who got married, they made them go through family planning courses. They had clinics and mobile clinics that were available in even remote areas to distribute birth control and educate people about family planning. And then they changed some of the government incentives in terms of taxes and benefits and so on to incentivize people to have fewer kids. And basically, it worked completely within just a few years. It reduced the birth rate from above 7 to replacement level. So technically, and this was a stamp to commemorate it that the government released. Unfortunately, that program was abandoned at a certain point by the government of Iran, and now their population is growing again. I'm not sure how rapidly, but it's growing. And so yeah, I think those types of programs are admirable and laudable, and I think that this should be one of the major elements of our movements. I think it's often overlooked. And I'm glad that you mentioned the importance of education as well, because obviously there's a big correlation that's been noted by many people over the years simply between education of women and girls and the birth rates.
Thank you. Thank you for being so brave.
Thank you.
Okay, Ted, you are on deck for your question and comment. And Art, you have the floor.
Yeah, well, thank you, Anitra, for calling him brave, because that's clearly what's behind my concern. You're in the process that you've been involved in over the years, Max. You certainly have possibly generated a lot of pushback and resistance from some quite powerful industries and people. Have you personally experienced any threats to you and your properties, family, etc.? And have there been any actions along these lines? Then if the answer to that is yes in some way, has that in any way increased your number of followers and actions, or was this pushback actually in support of the law and order and it worked?
Well, I'm screen sharing again here. I'm currently being sued along with these other people by the mining company Lithium Nevada Corporation, which is actually based in Vancouver, BC, for our campaign to try and stop that mine. So that's one example. The lawsuit's ongoing. It's a slow process. No fun. It's a civil lawsuit in this case, so they're threatening us with fines rather than jail time. But you know, like I said, I don't have barely any money, and none of us do, and they are attempting to pin possibly millions of dollars of damages on us for resisting the mine, for standing with the land. And this is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. They just got a $2.26 billion loan from the US government. So that's one example. I'm being fined by the federal government about $50,000 for something else related to Thacker Pass. We built some latrines out there for native elders who needed to use the bathroom and couldn't just go squat in the behind the bushes. You know, these were some people in wheelchairs and so on who weren't very healthy, and so they needed a better bathroom. And so we built just a pit toilet for them. And so we're being fined $50,000 for that. We're contesting it. We're fighting it. I've actually had FBI agents show up at my parents' house asking questions about me. They didn't have anything on me. It was just a harassment technique. They were just trying to gather information, and luckily my parents knew to just say, sorry, you know, we're not going to talk with you. And you know, a lot of people that I've worked with, there was a similar kind of an FBI sweep where they were trying to gather information on people and so on. There's a long history of this, of course. I mean, some of what the FBI does is great. Like if they are taking down child sex predators or something, like more power to them, you know. But of course, agencies like that have often been involved in political repression. Look at COINTELPRO, the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement. I mean, look at the Civil Rights Movement, MLK. They've been involved in some very sordid repression of people's movements, very violent, very abusive, and highly illegal in many cases. So those are some examples. I have been subjected to some physical threats at different times, out at camps in different areas, intimidation. I haven't faced personal violence. That's probably more because I'm in the United States. There's a lot of privilege associated with that. I'm a man. I'm white. Like, I have all these benefits to me. My friends, again, who are organizing in the Philippines, there are sometimes dozens of activists and organizers killed every year there or disappeared. And not necessarily people who are even talking about militant resistance, but just people who are engaging in basic forms of participation in civil society. So this is about that hierarchy of violence, right? There are certain forms of violence that are normalized and invisibilized in our society, and other forms that are fetishized and regarded as completely unacceptable. And this is why, for example, Jessica Resnicek, who sabotaged the Dakota Access Pipeline, she was charged with a terrorism crime and got a terrorism enhancement to her criminal sentence, and she got sentenced to 7 years in prison. Meanwhile, Dylan Roof, who was the white supremacist, who, if you remember, he went into a church, I believe, in South Carolina and killed something like 7 Black people in this church in an act of racist violence. He wasn't charged with terrorism for that crime. So there was no terrorism enhancement. He was still charged with murder, of course, but that wasn't considered an act of terrorism. And so these are politicized things. We'll see it change, we'll see it shift over time. But I do think it's really important that we have courage and that we take risks for these things. It's one thing to intellectually oppose the destruction of the planet, these very destructive and abusive systems. That's good and it's righteous, and we should continue doing it. But we really need to take risks, and ultimately, I think that's an individual thing that has to come out of each person's heart. That has to be a conversation with yourself. What am I willing to do? Who am I really? How do I stand in line with my values and reflect that in my actions? And how do I sleep at night? And I can't tell anyone else what they can and can't do, because everyone has their unique circumstances that they're dealing with. But I do think it's important that we have courage.
Thank you. Very good answer.
Thank you so much, both. John Hollins, you are on deck. You can turn on your video and microphone. And Ted, you have the floor for your question and comment.
Yeah, Max, that was excellent. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it when I heard you before. One comment on something that you raised, or one other person raised, which is, can the creation of a movement go global? And in fact, it did with apartheid. And many of us, in fact, were involved with it at the time. So it can catch on. So just to make an observation, yes, it has at least happened once in the past, and I hope it can again. My question, I was on the beach when Greenpeace was founded. We didn't even know it was going to until we all mobbed up on the beach below UBC to essentially fight the bulldozing of a freeway around it. And we won. And not only that, but Greenpeace was actually founded on that site. Some of us weren't even aware that that was when it was happening. We were just a little farther down the beach. But the fact is that it has been fairly eminent in dealing with environmental issues. So my question really is, has it made a difference? And are any of the tactics that it uses useful? Have they made a difference?
Yeah, good question. Full disclosure, I worked for Greenpeace for I think 3 days when I was probably about 17.
Yeah.
I was one of those very annoying people who was canvassing, trying to raise money for them. And
I've just
after
been able to give them money. That's all.
yeah, it may have been 2 days, and I was like,
Yeah.
I'm not cut out for this. This
Yeah.
isn't me. But you know, Greenpeace has done a lot of good work over the years. They've done a lot of amazing things, I think, and you know, raising awareness, their reports, some of the bold direct actions that they've been involved in to raise awareness. Of course, they just you're probably aware they just were sued in North Dakota by Energy Transfer Partners, the company
Well,
behind
they've
the
been
Dakota
sued by
Access.
all sorts of people, including New
Yeah,
Zealand
yeah, yeah.
and the States and Alaska. Yeah, the list is copious.
Yeah. This latest suit, I think it's $350 million or something. So
Oh,
it could wipe out
yeah.
Greenpeace in the United States, essentially. They're countersuing, I think, in a European jurisdiction right now.
Mm.
I have some disagreements with Greenpeace's official positions on things like green technology.
Yeah.
I have differences with them. I also have friends who've been part of the group and who've worked closely with it. So, you know, it's one of those situations where it depends on the context, it depends on
Yeah.
the situation. I personally tend to be someone who, at this point, I'm not donating or getting involved in environmental organizations at that scale generally,
Yeah.
because I think that there's a lot of bureaucracy and there's a lot of compromises that come about necessarily because of that type of status. Some of the stuff that they were involved in around logging projects and deals with the logging industry and so on leave a pretty bad taste in my mouth. So, but I'm not going to say that they're worthless by any means. I think they do a lot of good work. So it's a complex answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ted.
Okay, thank you so much. Kent, you are on deck. You could turn on your camera, or Art, if you turned off the camera, please turn it back on. And John Hollins, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Max, thank you very much for laying out the various techniques that have been used. Have there been any protests with results with which you are satisfied?
Yeah, there have been some. I mean, there are victories in the movement. They're usually at relatively small scales, and they're usually temporary, unfortunately. That's the nature of being an environmental defender, is we're defenders, not, you know, we're not offensive generally. You know, a couple examples, I was involved in the peripherally in the movement against coal, building some coal export terminals just south of Vancouver, BC, on the US side of the border, north of Bellingham. There, that movement was successful, defeated this major coal export terminal proposal. I was involved to some extent, to a greater extent, in the movement to stop a big water extraction project scheme in eastern Nevada that would have piped water down 500 or 600 kilometers to Las Vegas, and in the process would have completely desertified, you know, and a Great Basin National Park, all these wilderness areas, these beautiful Great Basin landscapes. We won. We defeated that project, and it was a coalition between environmentalists, tribes, and ranchers and farmers, mostly conservative ranchers and farmers out there in that area, that defeated that project. Another export project on the coast of Oregon, a major liquefied natural gas export facility, was defeated by a people's movement. There are a lot of examples like this. Unfortunately, most of those successes are, we're defeating an expansion of the system. We're not rolling the system back, you know? We're not shutting down the existing oil refineries, the existing pipelines. We're stopping a new one from being built. Meanwhile, another new one is built, you know, the next state over, or the next province over. So this is, I wish I had better news, but I mean, of course, it's not a surprise to you, John, or anyone else. Like, we've been on the defensive as a movement, and we've been kind of in retreat for a long time.
I was born in England just before the outbreak of World War II. I didn't know it at the time, of course, but it became clear to me later on that the population of the United Kingdom really pulled together as a whole nation in addressing the severe problem that it has. With global heating, we, all the peoples of the world have a severe problem. There's a more recent example of a population pulling together. The president of the United States, elected last November, has made significant, what Canadians see as significant threats. It's not just tariffs. He's talked about taking over Canada as the 51st state. So I'm living in a country with an unusually strong, coherent grasp of a particular situation. Do you think how will the kind of protests that you like, combined with the kind of advocacy that I undertake, which is writing letters to newspapers, is there any prospect of getting a whole a population, an electorate, on the same wavelength that you're on and I'm on, although we use different techniques?
Yeah, I think there could be. I mean, there's some book about rationing that came out a number of years ago that I haven't read, but it's been on my list. I was trying to find the title of it for a while, but I think a quote that I heard, or I saw a quote in an article about that book, was something about how during World War II in England, despite the rationing, or because of the rationing rather, the poorest people actually ate better than they did before the rationing system was implemented. They had better nutrition and a better diet, better food security. And I thought that was so interesting. It made me want to read the book, and I think there's probably a lot of, in a sense, opportunities like that in this future world, is that if we are going to implement some of these practices to draw down collectively, to scale down, we're going to need to figure out ways to do it fairly and to do it in a participatory way. And that is going to be incredibly difficult, of course, mainly because the powerful will not be happy with that. They don't want any redistribution. But there is an opportunity in it to some extent. And I think that there may be, I think it's possible that there could be sort of degrowth oriented political parties that begin to gain actual sway, probably first in smaller localities, and then building from there. That might not happen via the government structures that we currently have available. This might be more like parallel to existing government structures, prepared to take over for them when they begin to fail, or they become irrelevant for one reason or another. I think it's possible. Do I think it's super likely? Am I seeing it happening right now? Not really. I mean, there are a few places in the world, small scales, where people are doing things like this, but they're generally quite small, unfortunately. But I think it's possible, and I think we have to keep pushing. And, I mean, if you look at the politics of the youngest cohort of people who are growing up right now, you're sort of seeing this bifurcation. Some people are going hard right and following Trump, and they're following Andrew Tate, and they're sort of doubling down on that worldview. But a large majority of young people, I think, have a pretty forward-looking worldview on these things. I think the challenge is likely that if those degrowth movements are going to survive, they're really going to have to cross partisan lines and not just fall into tribalistic politics. You're either with us or you're against us. And that's a big challenge in today's world, especially because of the internet. Like, people just don't know how to work together anymore, don't know how to work across difference.
Okay, thank you both. And now, Kent, you have the last question.
Well, thank you. And I won't take too long. I just want to raise what to me is a very deep concern. And I just finished recently reading Timothy Snyder's book called Bloodlands, which describes it's essentially the story of the mass killings carried out by both Stalin and Hitler in Central Europe in the 1930s and 40s. And it's just absolutely grim reading. I mean, my God, it's just the level of cruelty is inconceivable. And yet it happened. It really happened. And so I guess my question is, and I don't have an answer to it, so I'm not this is not a rhetorical move. I'm just genuinely asking there's a real risk that the kind of civil disobedience that you argue for, and similar to what other people have practiced, could be met with a literally Stalin level of response. Like,
Right.
So if you, for Stalin, if you protested something, he's not only going to kill you, he's going to kill your aunts and uncles and second cousins and everybody who ever spoke to them. Yeah. And he's going to maybe bulldoze the village they live in as well, just to make a point, right? And so the point is you could end up with a response that is so brutal as to simply wipe everything out. And anyway, I just wonder what your response to that kind of risk. I mean, we see this spooling up in the US right now, where you look at what Trump and his minions are doing, right, to people right now. It's not quite at the Stalin level yet, but they're going in that direction.
Certainly, yeah, certainly. And I wish I had a better answer. Those in power use violence because it works. It's
kill everybody, and then
violent repression is brutally effective, and that's why they do it. Yeah. So I think the only real answer to that is for us to examine what we're really fighting for and what we're really willing to sacrifice. And this is where I think that a lot of the lifestyle environmentalism that came to characterize our movement, the environmental movement, the fact that the modern environmental movement in North America was really sort of Silent Spring and Earth Day and all that. It was the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. These were important things, but it didn't necessarily emerge out of like a national liberation struggle or these types of movements where we've really seen people willing to put their lives on the line and fight and die, or stand non-violently and die, or be tortured or be jailed. We've seen that in the environmental movement, but that's not really the roots of the, at least North American environmental movement. And I think this is one reason why many of the most confrontational environmental struggles in North America have emerged from indigenous communities, because they're coming out of communities, they're coming out of land struggles, essentially. They're coming out of basic sovereignty struggles where people have a history of fighting and dying for their land. And
literally millions at times.
Yeah. And that's a real challenge. How do we build this level of dedication? But the final thing I'll just say is I've been kicking around this idea for a long time for an article, and I've been wanting to write it. I have a list of like 150 article ideas that I want to write, or I'll come up with an idea and write down the note, and then I don't get to a lot of them. But this one is about how state repression actually often makes, well, it's like the JFK quote: "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." Right? There's a sense in which the more repression you have, the more you create the backlash, right? And even the most despotic regimes on earth that have sort of just taken a scorched earth approach to their opposition, they're still, in a way, they're sowing the seeds of their own fall. They can only ever fall. They will fall. And the only question is like when and how that will happen. And I think that, as we're seeing in the UK, for example, with the criminalization of basic forms of civil disobedience, one result of that has been a lot of the movements have turned to sabotage, for example, because it's actually safer for them to be completely anonymous, to go out and turn off a gas pipeline or cut. Some of them were cutting like internet lines and power lines to financial institutions that are deeply involved in fossil fuel financing and so on, things of this nature. It's actually safer for them to do that at night, with a mask on, with some friends, than it is to go out and non-violently, block a road or do a lockdown or some typical types of civil disobedience like this. And I think this is the world that we're sort of rapidly entering, unfortunately. And the final thought that I'll just share, I don't know if it was somebody brought up apartheid in South Africa earlier. And in Nelson Mandela's autobiography, or his book, I don't know if it's technically an autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, he talks about how, I'm seeing if I can find the quote. He talks about, I don't know if I can find the exact one, but he says the form of struggle in many cases, oh, here it is. He writes, "It's always the oppressor, not the oppressed, who dictates the form of the struggle. If the oppressor uses violence, the oppressed have no alternative but to respond violently. In our case, it was simply a legitimate form of self-defense." That's out of context. The context, of course, is that the African National Congress was organizing political rallies and public talks and protests and so on for many years, decades. And then they were outlawed by the apartheid state. And they essentially had to make a choice. Do we just give up, or do we go underground and, deliberately continue fighting, even though we're illegal now? It's completely illegal to be part of this group. And they chose the latter. They chose to fight, essentially. And so, I think that it's a dire situation. I mean, there's no way around it. It's incredibly dire. But we can look to these examples throughout history of communities and people who have faced similar circumstances of increasing repression, and look to their courage, look to their strategies, and try and learn what we can from them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ken.
Again, thank you both. And now Ted Manning has the floor to give our official thanks.
I'm delighted to do this. I find it very interesting every time. And I'm inspired by the range of research that you've been doing and looking at what happens. I'll just add a very quick two little anecdotes that may be instructive as well. People don't necessarily do what we believe they may. Their behaviors tend to be very different. I will give you two examples. One of them is why all the old order Amish have isolated themselves in Paraguay after 3 different migrations, and are now essentially cutting themselves off completely from a society, economy, and environment that they do not believe they should live in. The same thing happened in Jonestown, Guyana, where I was actually there a few days after it happened. I was in charge of the planning of that particular frontier colonies. They again took their people away for religious reasons and other things, and decided that they were going to try and live totally separately. And small societies can be just as bad as big ones when things come to the crunch. So thank you very much for giving us some interesting ideas and some interesting examples. And hopefully you can come back and report to us later on how much better it got after people actually listened to you. So thanks again for coming. And we'll just say to everybody, if you don't belong already, we do try to raise money, as everybody has to make sure that you have a membership. We have opened a new associate membership for people who don't want to participate directly in the club, but who just wish to watch the good outputs that we do. And we also would like you to subscribe when you are watching this on YouTube, because that will help us in terms of the outreach that we are able to get. And as Art can tell us very much, we are getting into the tens of thousands of people who get to read some of these or see some of these things online. we are a success story, or at least we like to think so. So thank you all very much for coming. You may now put on your video and audio and talk to each other and say things that you